was the first time I really learned what it meant to be vulnerable, because it was one of the first times that I consciously connected with new people to make friends. I went from a small co-ed liberal education focused school to a large women's college filled with young people from backgrounds very different from my own. Many of them were the first in their family to attend college. They didn't really share the perspectives or ideologies I grew up with at home and school. Many of them were brought up with conservative values. But rather than feeling disoriented or alien, this experience was strangely very freeing for me. And more significant to this course, the lack of common ground made me look for other ways to connect. I wasn't planning on spending 3 years without friends and fun. What I found when I did begin to forge friendships was that my peers in college felt worry, outrage, sorrow, and joy for reasons much different from me. This was largely due to our different social backgrounds. I came from a background where thoughts and feelings were communicated and discussed freely. At school, we went an hour every week in a conversation circle discussing themes such as fear, competition, relationships, and freedom, to name a few. So, my feelings and thoughts were not just part of my internal landscape, they were also material for a group discussion. But for my college peers, their feelings and thoughts were not material for discussion. They were the stuff of bonding. For example, Swarna, sharing that her family will most likely get her married right after college and the fear that filled her with. Three other girls who were going to meet the same fate gathered around her, I remember, to empathize with Swarna's fear. I admired how they spoke so openly and bonded around something that I, in those unwise years, saw as a regressive social evil. I had failed to understand or empathize with someone like Swarna. I was reacting to her situation from a strongly progressive ideology. After all, in my liberal school and home, marriage was always presented as a choice. I had no way of understanding Swarna's fear, and while we were happy and cordial around each other, I was painfully aware of a distance. But I was playing a part in that distance as well. While it's true that our backgrounds, perspectives, maybe even values were different, that wasn't the only cause of the disconnection. As I struggled to empathize with her and other peers' situations, I also wasn't really letting her in on my joys, sorrows, frustrations, or fears. She must have really thought I had my life spent splendidly together. So while I was fascinated and admiring of my peers' ability to share openly and vulnerably, I felt uncomfortable about doing the same. I realize now that I might have felt scared of appearing weak, inadequate, not self-actualized enough perhaps. With time, and after witnessing some of my peers being free with their emotions and making memorable bonds, this guardedness gradually began to disappear. I began sharing freely to connect, and the distance between us closed. Some of the people I connected with in college are still my closest friends even today. When I think back to this experience, I understand that it's a perfect example of reciprocal vulnerability. When founded in emotional safety and trust, this type of relationship drives authenticity and therefore true connection. However, the first step is a big one, embracing and leaning into our vulnerability. And by being able to do this, we create the invitation for another person to do the same. Showing vulnerability is easier said than done. It might help to learn something I read in a 2018 article in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology article titled Mess Effect. The title is derived from a term the authors gave to an interesting phenomenon in which we perceive ourselves as inadequate, flawed, or vulnerable, and are likely to see ourselves as a mess. However, and here's the kicker, we are appreciative of others when they show the same kind of vulnerability. So when we feel like we're falling apart, failing, or a mess, other people view our vulnerability favorably and maybe even with admiration. You are not a mess in other people's eyes. Looking back, I realized the beautiful mess effect was in play when I began college. I withheld sharing my vulnerability because I was afraid it would reveal the fact that I was a mess, like being worried about not knowing what I wanted to do after my BSc, for instance. All my peers seemed to know or accept their future. Either way, they had clarity. But I was also in awe of my friends who shared so openly. With time, watching them model vulnerable sharing, I was able to do it too. And there began our close and authentic friendships where fear, jealousy, anxiety, sadness, and anger were welcomed, not hidden away inside of us in shame. These negative feelings I just listed are often used to measure and judge people, which is why we learn to hide them and project a fine at all times, flawless face to the world. No one wants to appear insecure or heartbroken. It's terrifying to expose what often feels like weakness. But when you watch and appreciate how others embrace vulnerability, it shows you the way to a more authentic you, which is ultimately a healthier you, kind and true to yourself. When you're authentic with yourself, you have a chance at truly meaningful relationships in which you can trust you'll be taken seriously, allow yourself to be positively influenced, and experience personal growth. Vulnerability is a crucial quality. It makes holistic well being possible, not just for the individual, but for those we have relationships with too. Imagine communities in which everyone can speak and act from a space of shared vulnerability. We could hear about and solve humanity's fears, sorrows, and angers. We could support and encourage each other's hopes and dreams, no matter how unconventional. With this beautiful goal in mind, I hope you'll join me for the rest of this course, where I'll share how you can embrace vulnerability, why vulnerability is so important for your well being and the well being of our communities, and finally, how you can draw on the power of vulnerability to transform the way you live, relate, create, and lead. But before we begin lesson one, here's a little activity to help you tune into yourself. When do you feel comfortable showing your vulnerability? And conversely, what is it about a situation or person that makes showing your vulnerability a disconcerting proposition? I am Pallavi Phatak, an education professional and lifelong learner. I've experienced such rich connection, communication, and growth by learning to embrace vulnerability. I look forward to helping you do the same.